I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Anyone who takes an interest in the history of English or Old Norse or any other Germanic language will take a great interest and really profit from learning to read Gothic, as it's the oldest Germanic language in which we have long written records. But much too often, I see people who are compelled by the fascination of that very statement and get immediately discouraged when they reach Gothic texts and realize that they can't immediately read them. This usually happens a little bit after someone enthusiastically looks up some vocabulary, maybe some noun and verb paradigms, and says, oh, this isn't so bad. This actually looks kind of like Old Norse. But the problem is, syntactically, it's not that much like uh, Old Norse or another more familiar Old Germanic language. There are a couple of archaic characteristics that Gothic has that are immediately going to pose a problem to you if you don't know that they're there. But if you do know that they're there, you have no reason to be intimidated by them. So, since I am opening up my Gothic reading group to new entrants in April and May, and I want people who don't have a ton of experience to feel welcome and ready to participate, I want to show you what these two big problems are and why, again, if you're prepared for them, you shouldn't feel intimidated by them at all. And by the way, I should flag just in case that when I talk about a Gothic reading group, of course, I'm not saying that we're reading Dracula or, God forbid, The Lair of the White Worm. All right, so what are these two big characteristics of Gothic that are so different from another Germanic language? They are clitics and they are pro-drop verbs. So the latter is maybe a little bit easier to appreciate because plenty of other familiar languages are pro-drop. They just aren't other Germanic languages. So in Spanish, to take a uh, friendly, familiar example, I don't have to explicitly state the subject of a verb because that verb is already inflected to reflect who the subject is, right? I can simply say amo, and that's I love. I don't have to say yo amo. I can say amas, and that's you love. I don't have to say tu amas, you love. That subject pronoun is not wrong. It's just emphatic, right? um, Joe Amo, right? Like, I love you, right? I'm the one in particular who does. Now, plenty of Germanic languages inflect verbs for the subject, right? In Old Norse, I would say ek an, I love, but thu ant, you love. But except in archaic Old Norse poetry, it's pretty normal to have that pronoun there anyway. In Gothic, it's not. Gothic is going to be a situation more like a Spanish or a Greek or a Latin or a Sanskrit, where that verb's inflection is all that you're usually going to get to show you who the subject is. And if you're not ready for it, some stuff is therefore not going to look like a verb and you're not going to read it right. However, the good news is the verb endings themselves are going to tend to be fairly familiar ones from other Old Germanic languages. Let me show you, for example. This is usually what it looks like in the Gothic reading group. I'll show you a stanza in Gothic, then I'll show you the same stanza in the earliest known translation into Icelandic. So probably the closest comparable existing translation in another language. And then Strykberg's reconstruction of the Greek text that Wolfila's Gothic text is based on. It's not necessarily identical to the normal Greek New Testament, but it often is. And then what you see at the top, the English glossing, that's from us having actually read this in the Gothic reading group. And after the student who volunteers to read the verse has read it, I then put in the English word by word translation. But notice here we have, and then it's a question, when did we see you as a guest and give you hospitality? Or when did we see you naked and we clothed you? So notice all of these first person plural verbs, these we verbs, right? We saw, we gave hospitality, we clothed. Is the ending for the first person plural verb in Gothic quite consistently, like in Old Norse, right? That is an excellent signal that you're looking at a first person plural verb. You just don't see the word we there, right? You would see ver there in Old Norse, but you don't see the Gothic cognate wis typically, unless again it's emphatic. Same thing with the second person plural, which in 2543 we get a bunch of. So I was a guest. Actually, here you see was, very familiar, right? Looks just like English was. Um, Means the same thing, but we don't have the word I there, right? So I was a guest, gastswas, and you didn't host me. You didn't give me hospitality. There's that second person plural verb form. Same thing. I was naked and you did not give me clothes. Second person plural verb. I was sick in jail and you didn't visit me. Second person plural verb form. So something about not having those pronouns to signal who's doing it can really throw people off who are used to other Germanic languages where those pronouns are always going to be there, right? Someone who's used to reading Old Norse prose, German prose, is used to seeing those pronouns. But you're also used to, if you're used to those languages, the inflected verb endings. So what you have to do with Gothic is get used to the verb ending itself being the only signal that you're going to get. This isn't that different from learning to read something like Spanish or Latin, but something about it being in a Germanic language, I don't know, throws a caltrap out there on the road that people can sometimes find it a little bit hard to jump over. Learn those verb endings for common verb types. They're not very different at all from other Germanic languages. And just again, be ready to look for those as your single flag as to who's doing the action. Now, the other thing that is a big challenge for reading Gothic relative to other Germanic languages, and this is going to be something that's not present in quite so many familiar languages, right? This is something that, for comparison, I typically think of a language like, Hittite and is clitics. So Gothic can infix and postfix clitics, that is meaningful, not exactly suffixes, but word, well, morphemes for those of you who are into the language of linguistics. And you don't necessarily read those in the same order in English as you would in Gothic. Let me show you some examples because it makes more sense with examples. I isolated a bunch of sentences that have these. All right, so sa I frioth atan athel athin uvar mik. That means that one who loves father or mother over me. And the who is actually this E that's attached to that saw. That saw isn't so unfamiliar, right? That's masculine nominative singular. That one, right? That guy. But the E is a clitic, and that's actually what makes that relative. So that one who. So sometimes these can show up in less familiar context than that. The really difficult one for people is often this sahwazuch, nu sa I and hatith miss and anwerthia mane. And is what that means. So this is, you got three pieces of this compound here. Sa, again, that familiar masculine nominative singular, that one. Hwas, actually, if you take a moment to consider, not very different from Old Norse. Where, which is its cognate, right? Each one in an indicative sentence, or who in an interrogative sentence. But each one of them, and each one of them is what this is. Sahwazuch. Now, in English, obviously, in translation, we're going to make that the first word in the sentence. But it is a double challenge here because you have to get used to looking for the word and not necessarily being the first word in the sentence and being a separate word. You're going to look for it as something attached to another word, right? And it's making a compound that looks weird, like what am I supposed to do with sahwasu, right? That doesn't look like anything in a cognate language, but it's made of at least the first two pieces, pieces that are quite familiar just with that extra clitic. Now, that is also not necessarily always going to occur in contexts where you would expect the word and to be. Um, this clitic, which goes back to Proto-Indo-European, also gets used in some contexts to create a new lexeme, more or less. And the difference can be subtle in distinguishing it from the lexeme that doesn't have that clitic. You know, think of like a Latin quisque, where actually that que is the same clitic going back to Proto-Indo-European that you're seeing in Latin. Like, look at this example. Thu is sa quemanda to antharizu bidema. You are that one coming, or we await bidema. Another, so that's antharis, genitive singular, another, and then that there's not necessarily, it's not and, right? But it seems to be particularizing the other, right? Or do we await another one, perhaps? So again, kind of like Latin quisque, you can get a sort of subtly different lexeme out of that suffixed one. But the main thing to keep in mind as a beginner reading Gothic is just not to be intimidated by words that have that extra ooh. Sometimes it becomes oh, depending on the vowel at the end of the previous word. That's perhaps to be read as the word and, especially if what you're looking at is the first word in a sentence or clause, and otherwise might make a very subtle lexical distinction. But you should be looking up probably the word before that ooh element. So one other thing occurred to me to point out that people can find a little bit challenging about Gothic, and this is in fact something that I would doubt is necessarily natively part of conversational Gothic as the uh, Gothic bros hanging out around Wolfula spoke it, but is part of reading Gothic as we have it because it is an aspect of the Greek of the New Testament that Wolfula is translating. And that is that you extremely often get pairs of participles and verbs. Let me give you an example here. Sa and nimans is wis mick and nimeth. So that one receiving you receives me. So it's paired, right? Whoever receives you receives me would be a more natural way of putting that in any other Germanic language I can think of off the top of my head. It's certainly how it's put in that Icelandic translation below. Uh, but Wolffield is going to translate just where he can translate one Greek word by a Gothic word that is functionally equivalent. That's what he's going to do. He's not going to reword it unless it just would make a completely different message in Gothic. Another example here. Ja, andhafians Jesus quathtu im. So, and answering, Jesus said to them. Honestly, in conversational English, we'd probably use only one of those words. Jesus answered them, or something along those lines. So there's a ton of present participles, but the present participles have that "and" suffix, which shouldn't be too unfamiliar to you from other Germanic languages. So if you read up on your Gothic paradigms, and there's good books for doing that, there's Lambden, it's the very old Rite, which is still very good. The paradigms on Wiktionary are good. You read up on those paradigms and be prepared to deal with watching verb endings for who the subject is, watching out for that those clitics and especially ooh, and then knowing there's going to be a lot of present participles that are also used with an inflected verb, you're going to be fine. And the amount of feedback that I give in the Gothic Reading Club is very much calibrated to, help people that have exposure to something like Old Norse or German or Old English, but not yet to Gothic. There's no judgment if you come in without having a lot of background in this. Nobody goes home snickering about, like, ha ha ha, he didn't know that was the vocative of whatever. Well, yeah, Gothic has a vocative case, but it's usually pretty easy to figure out. Right. The idea is to help each other learn and, enjoy nerding out about something with each other. We get a lot of language history stuff um, as sort of side notes and rants in this group. So come join if that interests you, or join the Old Norse reading group, which is similar. Um, Also, by the way, the Gothic reading group is included in admission to the Intro to Runic Studies group in April and May because I think that it's a very helpful skill to practice if you want to read Elder Futhark inscriptions. They're a lot more like Gothic than they are like Old Norse. Um, yeah, and otherwise, check out the books, check out the Patreon if you enjoy these videos made without agenda or mysticism about old languages, old myths, old runes, etc. And from beautiful Colorado out of the wind, I'm wishing you all the best.